Okay. We've got an agenda. Secretary Young, if you want to just kick us off. And I know Jane wants to add something to the agenda, but
Okay, let's
Secretary Young.
go. Good morning, everybody. It is September 29, 2021. This is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Steering Committee. It's a special meeting. I'm still having issues navigating through to the calendar. So let me.
I'm happy to lay out the agenda if you'd like me to, Secretary Young.
I've got it right
it's
here.
in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, so today we are going to review and approve the September 14 meeting minutes. Nope, that's not the one. That's yesterday's. Sorry.
So many meetings. So
many
little time.
meetings. Yeah, I don't know why it went to the September 14. Okay, why don't you go ahead, David? I've just unfortunately backed out of the website again.
No worries. So yeah, so today we need to look at our October 12th council meeting agenda. That's our big thing we want to do today. We want to circle back and look at how it went with the decision-making protocol yesterday and what else we want to say around that and how we want to get the council to sign off on that. And then Jane has at least two things and may add another on. One is an update on the cross-cutting thematic group and how that's going. And then to talk about whether we need to add some council meetings in November and essentially go to weekly meetings. And Jane, I believe you have one other thing you wanted to add to today.
I wanted to revisit the October 5th council agenda for next week and just discuss it quickly. And then I have a recommendation for a change for the agenda we're going to discuss for October 12th today as well.
Okay. Great. So the suggestion here is just let's look at next week's agenda quickly because there's a suggestion there about that. So before we move forward, is everybody okay adding that item to the agenda that Jane says looking at next week's council thing? Yep. I see Chris saying yep. Okay. And anything else on today's that we need to do for today's work in addition to what's on the page and what's being suggested? Are we good? Okay, great. All right, so let's start out looking at, or Jane, the thing that you want to look about for next week's agenda, is it helpful to see that first or second? Essentially, should we look at October 5th first?
Yeah, I think Jerry's comment in the chat is helpful, actually. I think that it's going to be important for us to talk about the October 5th and October 12th agendas together. But I will say that my comment on the October 5th agenda might not be the same. The comment that I want to talk about for October 12th, I understand how it relates to October 5th, which has to do with the carbon budget and the recommendations coming out of Ag and Eco and where that fits most appropriately around that. And then I will say for October 5th, there's a recognition that based on the conversation we had yesterday around the definitions that Science and Data prepared, I'd like to ensure that the full suite of definitions for the foundational criteria are reviewed and approved by the council next week.
Got it. Okay, so let's look at these together. I just dropped October 5th agenda in the chat if folks want to click on it. Yeah. And what Jane, you're saying is for next week, October 5th, in addition to what we already have on here, you'd like to add a item about pulling together all 5 foundational criteria and the sort of, this is how we view these definitions and how we want to do prioritization. That's what you're saying, Jane? Yeah,
recognition that I'd like to seek the steering committee's approval to roll those out today, with recognition that the Science and Data Committee will inform those definitions for cost effectiveness specifically this afternoon. But I also feel like we need to be moving forward with the conversation about how prioritization is going to work with the subcommittees this week, but bearing approval of the formal definitions next week. I do feel like that's important with the council. So I want to just understand and appreciate that things are moving really fast. And so I want to put out prioritization and guidance around that today, but just wanted to take everybody's pulse on that. And then appreciate that those definitions are informed by science and data, as well as other iterations of work through engagement with the council and cross-cutting counselor members. And so just feel like because it's so important prioritization on how we're going to lift up our work, that I feel like it should come back to the council next Tuesday just for a final approval. But that can all be posted with the October 5th agenda today or tomorrow, so that people have access to it, so they can review it ahead of time.
Okay, great. Jared, is your comment about the same issue?
Well, first, yes, I support that. And related to that, I would say that given how busy and important the rest of the October 5th agenda is, and just looking at it, I would not be surprised if we see some running over. I would volunteer and suggest that we move, and given how comparatively light the October 12th agenda looks to October 5th, that we move the GHG inventory and accounting discussion to the 12th, especially because there are some connections between that and the carbon budget discussion, which, if I heard you correct, Jane, you were proposing that report and recommendations would be presented for discussion on the 12th as well. And I think given recent conversations between the Science and Data Subcommittee and the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, I think it would be good if those kind of happened together, given the connection between them. So that would be my proposal to, yes, agree with what you said, and to help free up space for it to do that agenda switch.
Great.
That sounds great.
Okay, so we are adding an item about the prioritization, 5 foundational criteria and definitions into October 5th, and we're shifting the GHG accounting to the subsequent agenda. Okay. Secretary Young?
Yeah, on the cost effectiveness definition, I just want to make sure I'm following along. Yesterday, we were presented with a definition that people clearly had concerns and questions about that were voiced. And my understanding was that was going to go back to the subcommittees this week, and we would get perhaps a revised definition or clarity around the existing definition. But what you're suggesting is that you put the same definition out today?
No,
and amend it later, or?
I'll clarify. Jared and I and others have, we worked to sort of take the definition from science and data and further refine it to make it more applicable in prioritization, in order to have a high, moderate, and low consideration for cost effectiveness. And what was, I felt, muddying the water yesterday with the conversation with the council was this distinction that it was very much the definition for prioritization informed and built upon the science and data definition. However, people would have received it and wondered why they had acted on one definition and not the other. And so what I hope to do this afternoon with science and data is sort of ensure that we merge and marry the two succinctly, and then share that updated prioritization work guidance that includes definitions for all 5 foundational criteria. Well, actually 4, because equity is defined via the scoring rubric, and then move to consider all 4 of those foundational criteria definitions next Tuesday with the council, which will include cost effectiveness, but also include technical feasibility, which was already approved, impact, and co-benefit, which the council has not approved yet.
Okay, and just to be clear, Jane, the cost effectiveness piece that you're going to share around, does it incorporate in those like 3 big ideas that were coming out of the conversation yesterday? Does it try to address those in a way, or does it have something to say about those pieces that were the ones that were causing
it very much speaks to how ag and ecosystems and rural resilience will use it, and it speaks to a lesser extent externalities, but a bit more in a qualitative way. But I'm hopeful that we'll get to that this afternoon with science and data if there's a way to be more accountable and measurable.
Great.
I believe those were the two main points at the council meeting yesterday.
Okay.
Jared,
Great.
please, if I'm mischaracterizing your understanding of that or want to build upon that, please.
No, I agree with everything you said, Jen. I would just add to put a to try to clarify what I see, and I'm curious if folks agree, as one of the next steps is the definition of cost effectiveness is very clear in the literature. It's cost divided by outcome, or cost divided by desired outcome. I don't think that that is a question or a concern. The question that I think still needs to be asked is, in the context of adaptation and resilience strategies, what is the agreed upon desired outcome? What is the denominator of that equation? It is very clear in the mitigation literature. We're talking about cost divided by GHG pollution reduction, cost per ton of GHG emissions avoided. It is not clear. So what the desired outcome is, what that denominator is in some of the other contexts we're talking about. So what I would just suggest is that hopefully that basic definition of cost effectiveness, broadly speaking, isn't a concern. It's that I think there needs to be further discussion among those subcommittees and among those focused on those pathways and strategies about, is there agreement on the desired outcomes that those pathways and strategies are aimed at, in a way that's as simple and can be inserted into that definition in the way that a cost per ton of greenhouse gas emissions avoided can be in the mitigation space. I don't know that it can, because adaptation and resilience are trying to incorporate so many different things. So there might need to be multiple kind of specific applications of that broad cost effectiveness approach of cost divided by outcome.
Thanks, Jared. Okay. All right. So in summary, Jane's sending out later today a document that gives guidance on prioritization and this applying the 5 foundational criteria. It will include some definitions and some greater clarity on this. And science and data is meeting later today. And if there's anything more that you all can do around that, so much the better. And Jane, is your document coming out after that meeting of science and data?
Yeah, I have shared with science and data the complete draft for prioritization, and we'll look at it this afternoon. So Marion and I will work to post it with the agenda this afternoon, along with all of the cross-sector mitigation actions, which we now have for that as well.
Great. Okay. Super. Okay, and October 5th, we'll add that in. All right. Shall we look at October 12th? Is there anything else that folks need to look at for the 5th, or do we solve what we wanted to solve there?
Can I just make one comment? I do want to recognize and appreciate that the council meetings are a lot of presentations, and I know that some people are critiquing that. And one of the things next week in particular will be a presentation on the pathways analysis from Cadmus and EFG. I just want to put out there that if counselors have suggestions on how else to sort of consume this information that is coming up and out of subcommittees, as well as data analysis, that we're more than open to pivoting how we do things at the council if there's a better way or a different way that doesn't make it so much talking to. And next week is going to feel like that a bit because of how the data. So any suggestions on that? I think the steering committee especially is a great place to have that conversation as we move into just a rapid fire consumption of information from the subcommittee.
Yeah. Thanks, Jane. Okay. So that's food for thought. Let's keep working through our agendas. And if we want to circle back on that food for thought, let's do that. Erica, did you have a comment about that?
I just have a question for Jane. When are the actions matrices going to be available for council review from cross-sector?
We have them, all of them now, so we'll post them today.
Great. It was clear that some counselors had had a chance to look through stuff and some counselors hadn't. And I recognize there was a lot of information and it was overwhelming, but it was just really clear that people had been looking at those actions for the first time yesterday. And so anything that we can do to flag that, hey, things are posted, take a look. You did it last time, but just flag it for folks so that they can make sure that they're taking a look.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. And I think it's beholden on us to get those up as in advance as much as possible. And then all we can do is ask that counselors do their homework for the meeting. So
yeah, and I appreciate that you guys get them up. You know, you push us to get them up ahead of time, so that's good.
Thanks. Chris?
I was just going to say, I think the reality, though, is that the presentations need to be made. The public needs to see the presentations. It's not just us. And I think also just practical reality. I mean, my commissioners, any, planning commissions I work with, anybody else, I could ask them to do everything ahead of time, and it's not going to happen. So some level of presentation is going to be necessary. So I appreciate the critique, but I just don't know how realistic it is or frankly desirable, because right now our primary means of public engagement with regard to our discussions is, what's presented at the council meetings. And to my mind, for public visibility's sake, those presentations are critical.
Thanks, Chris.
That's my take.
Yeah, thanks so much. Secretary Young? Hang on, we can't hear you, Secretary Young. Something's going wrong.
No?
Oh, there we go. Now we got you.
Okay. Point of clarification on October 5. It is really packed. Lots of presentations. It tends to, I mean, I agree we need the presentations, but we need them, I think, paced in such a way. I thought yesterday's pace was great. This is about twice or three times the presentations. Did we just agree by consensus to move one or two of these to the 12th?
What we agreed to do, or what I heard you wanting to do, was to move that very last thing about the greenhouse gas inventory to the following meeting. The two things that aren't being moved are the Cadmus presentation and then the report outs from the different sectors for cross-sector. And we're adding in a conversation around the definitions of and the definitions of the 5 criteria for prioritization. That's what I heard. And indeed it is long. And what you all can say is, if you want to tell cross-sector task leads, you've got 10 minutes to present, right? In 10 minutes to have a conversation per sector. We could do that here in the steering committee, say, folks, you got to tighten this up. That's a signal you all can give. Or Cadmus, say, Cadmus, you've got 15 minutes to present. You don't have 25 minutes to present or whatever. It's the signals we want to send here.
Well, we certainly need to provide time for the presentations. We need time to ask questions and deliberate. Yeah, I'm just trying to be realistic as well. We don't get these things done in a very efficient way. And I'm just struggling looking at this agenda to see how we're going to get it done by 6, let alone 4:45. I don't know if others have thoughts on that. Fine, or we just give it a whirl and try to stay on task within the time allowed, which it all seems pretty tight.
Yeah. Liz, and then I have an idea on this. Liz, want to go ahead?
Sure. One question and 2 comments / ideas that you can add to yours. The question is, will the Cadmus analysis be only a slide presentation, or will we have a written report in draft form of any sort, Jane?
we will not have a written report.
Okay, so it'll be a version of what we've seen updated. Okay.
Fine,
then,
with a cumulative assessment. So it'll be
Yeah,
added
okay. Okay. Then my two comments are, first, I don't think we can or should give less time to cross-sector. Instead, I'm worried, as is, that we don't have enough given some of the the cross-cutting issues there. And second comment, I'm wondering whether we shouldn't consider a different way to present Cadmus. And so that's what I would challenge us to do, whether it's starting a half an hour earlier to allow their presentation up front, whether it's doing it at a special meeting at some other point, whether it's giving them counsel on how to organize their presentation so that new information is first and the conversation is focused there. But I think that's the key to making next week's meeting more meaningful.
Great. Okay. So we do have a challenge. I'm looking at the chat as well. Like, can we just call it a 4-hour meeting and recognize cross-sector is a funny thing, right? Because we're actually giving more time to cross-sector than we had to the other subcommittees, because cross-sector has these different task areas, right? So, but the way the agenda is structured right now, it's a half hour to have a presentation from Cadmus and some clarifying questions around it. And then it's 25 minutes each per task group, right? Per sector, right? Transportation, buildings. So in that 25 minutes, it's 10 to 15 minutes of presentation and then 15 minutes of conversation. That's the way it's structured right now. And we could tighten things up a little bit. And or we can just say, well, we're going to go till 5, for instance, and just as Jared put in the chat, I think. So I think both of those are good. If you want to give Jane and myself, authority to say, task leads, you've got 10 minutes. You don't have 15 minutes to each do your task. So it's just, I'd be interested in the signals that you want to have us send to the presenters about how tight to make these presentations, so we have time for conversation as well. I can't tell whose hands are new. I think Lauren, you've got a new hand up.
But in case Secretary Young or Liz need to speak still. No, okay. I appreciate Liz's comments and wonder, looking at the October 12th agenda, which does appear to be a bit lighter. And since we're moving Jared's presentation and recommendations from science and data, as well as agriculture and ecosystems around the inventory and the budget, if the Cadmus presentation could be then, and just because there's more space, but I'm not sure if it's foundation setting for the, okay, Jane's nodding, okay.
Unfortunately, it kind of is, right? It's like, it's the essence of how we understand the cross-sector mitigation things. I'm seeing in the chat as well from Liz, like maybe we put a little extra time towards transportation buildings because they are such an important piece of the emissions story. And then we tighten up the other two. We're happy to do that and create some additional conversation time around that. Secretary Moore.
I was just going to second what Liz had in the chat. I think that's makes a lot of sense and would create more space.
Great. Okay. Okay. All right. So let me just be clear then. We're going to signal to Cadmus, please front end in new information and focus on new information you haven't presented first, right? That's really the essence of what we need to do in addition to the overall piece that you need to present. We're going to put more time towards buildings and transportation discussion and presentation than we will the other areas. And we're going to extend the meeting out to 5 o'clock because particularly if we're going to have that conversation at the end about the prioritization and the definitions of the criteria. Those are the 3 things that I heard you all say for October 5th. Okay, and we're going to keep the start time the same. Okay, great. October 12th, should we take a peek at that? And see how we're feeling about that now. I can, it's been in the chat a couple times, but I'll put it back in the chat just so people have it open and handy. Hang on. No, I'm the one who needs to open it up. some reason, it's not doing my hyperlink action right now, but
I'll put
Jane,
it
if
in
you
the
want to
chat.
throw it in the chat, you just did, or Lauren
Or
did?
Lauren did.
Thank you. Group effort here, appreciate that. Okay, so here for October 12th, the key things that we wanted to put on the agenda, in addition to having a just transition reflection, and in that just transition reflection, we thought it'd be really interesting because several subcommittees would have started the process with Kaya of the conversations around just transitions and thinking about the rubric and everything. We'd want in the just transitions moment to have a reflection about what people are taking away, the sort of ahas that's happening from that. The second piece we wanted to do in this agenda is to get a proper debrief of big ideas and what happens, what's been happening, and all this public engagement that's been going on up and down the state, the 4 in-person meetings, the virtual meetings, the stakeholder meetings. And so we're going to have Climate Access and RISE do a proper presentation about that and really have a conversation of what that means for us as a council in the draft, the initial climate action plan. That we're suggesting investing an hour in that. We'll circle back in theory on October 12th on the decision-making protocol. We'll talk about that in just a second, but it's in here on the agenda right now for the council to say, yep, now we're moving into the throes of getting towards final text. We need to get this decision-making protocol finalized. And finally, we have a look at the climate action plan components that are ready for council review. And I think, Jane, you can explain this better, but those are things that are in the introduction and the sort of the opening pieces before we get to the pathways discussion in the initial climate action plan. So that's what we have. Jane, I know you had something else you wanted to put on here. Well, and we've also just shifted the greenhouse gas inventory conversation, accounting conversation onto this agenda. Jane.
Okay, yeah, couple comments. This must be a mistake on our part, but this agenda was actually updated based on feedback from Suzanne and Julie, and I had made specific comments, and so it should be clearer around the sections being circulated. I had added exactly what those sections are so people could see how they pertain to this agenda and how it all ties in, because it has to do with the transition section being put forward, the foundational criteria and prioritization section, as well as the GWSA requirements section and vision and goals section. And so just bear with me that our agenda should be clearer and it should have those spelled out, so that update wasn't made. But those are the sections that'll be circulated ahead of time. Next Tuesday, they'll be ready, and those are components of the CAP that we'll be acting on at the council. And then I also just wanted to reflect on the first component of the agenda for the Just Transitions moment. None of the subcommittees will have begun scoring rubric yet. And so based on the timeline, so if we want to keep that on the agenda, the timeline's been refined now based on how prioritization is going to work. That'll be the first week, and cross-sector will be the first subcommittee likely to engage in that. And then ag and ecosystems and rural resilience will come the following week. So
we need a new Jane. We need to change that. Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Jane. So we need to tap into one of the ideas that was emerging that we talked about yesterday. Okay, great. Secretary Young?
Yeah, again, for clarity, just so we all know what's ahead here. On October 12th, we have 30 minutes at the end of a meeting to review specific components of the plan and actually use our decision-making process to adopt sections of the plan. That gives me pause, especially knowing we haven't done the equity analysis. Is it our intent to review the climate action plan piecemeal without all of the equity and other component parts of it completed. And in 30 minutes, just seems unrealistic. This to me seems
Yes.
very critical here.
So they're not at all substantive sections of actions. They are, and so they don't rely on having gone through prioritization and equity. They're very much either components being adopted straight from statute that'll carry forward into the plan, or a summary of the just transitions principles, which have already been adopted. So I hope that these will be straightforward components, and everything else as it comes will have much, I would expect we'll have much more time on the agenda for discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks. A good clarification for me.
Right. I think that is going to be one of our challenges, Jane, though, is sort of like communicating what it is. Like if people are feeling uncomfortable about like agreeing to stuff because the fuller package isn't visible yet, if we do think it's possible to do this kind of approach of approving pieces of the introduction or this or that, we just need to transmit that clearly. So to say, this is a piece of the introduction, you know, or else I think we'll get the kind of pushback and the concerns like what Secretary Young's saying. Okay. All right. So anything else on this October 12th that we want to talk about right now? Is this looking good to folks?
I do just want to be clear that we've agreed by consensus to add in the greenhouse gas inventory and accounting and ag and ecosystems. And I will suggest that that is going to need a substantive time on the agenda. The conversation to date between the two task groups has required substantive time, so I imagine that the council will too. So it's not a 20-minute agenda item. It's I don't know, 45 minutes, I would think.
Great. Okay. And I may have missed something when we were talking about that earlier, but is it just that? Are we also circling back to social cost of carbon, or are we just doing the greenhouse gas? Is that the thing, or is there something else that gets tacked onto it?
There's the carbon budget gets tacked onto it.
The carbon budget. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as a council, we haven't looked at the carbon budget yet, or we have? We have not. Okay. Yeah, that sounds substantive. Okay. All right. Anything else on the 12th? All right, so let's get back to our agenda. So many agendas. The next thing that we wanted to talk about was the decision-making protocol and how it went yesterday, and the impact, the feedback we got yesterday, and how we want to deal with that and get the council to feel comfortable with the decision-making protocol going forward. So, you know, there were some clear messages yesterday. I wonder if folks want to just reflect on that. Let's just take ourselves, let's only spend about 5-10 minutes on this just to get a plan in place and understanding the messages we're hearing from the council. But just from your own memory of yesterday, what are you taking away from the council's reaction to what we put in front of them? And also sort of how it went yesterday, and what that means about adapting this protocol and finishing it. Any quick reflections on that? Chris?
I know there were a lot of concerns about the counselor, that if a counselor's concerns stem from lack of details in a proposal, counselors may ask for an item to be tabled for future iterations of the climate action plan.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything quite like that, but frankly, any counselor can ask for something to be tabled at any time. and that can always, then there'd be a vote on whether or not to table something. So for whatever reason, you know, somebody could ask it to be I don't know that I think that could be potentially, I mean, I trust my fellow counselors, but I could also see how, at least in theory, that could be abused. I'm personally not in favor of that. I think we just need to just per Robert's, I know we're not necessarily operating by Robert's rules, but just per normal procedure, I would imagine any counselor could ask for anything to be tabled, then we have a vote.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't call that out, because that just seems like trouble waiting to happen.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Definitely heard a lot of concern yesterday on that. Lauren and Liz.
I agree with Chris, and then also have a question. I don't think we came to agreement, or at least I don't remember that we did, on the designees voting. I dropped in the chat, and I'm going to again now, confirmation that the membership document that this body, the steering committee, approved several months back has the designees indicated by asterisk as well as the counselors, and that's what we should be using moving forward, since that's what this body agreed to. So just love to confirm that's how we're going to move forward, because I know there was a question yesterday and I don't think there was clarity around an answer.
Yeah, there was not clarity, and I think there are different views on this, Lauren. So I don't think that is something that has been agreed to. And I know there's some other hands, but I'd like to take this issue up just quickly. And because I can see Jane in the chat putting out some ideas that those asterisks shouldn't be overemphasized. There seems to be. Jane, can you just say a word about that? And then Secretary Moore or Liz, I don't know if you want to talk about that particular issue, but Liz, you don't. Okay, if you can hold just for a second. Liz, I do want to lean into this issue for a second, because I think it is not, Lauren, something that's actually been agreed to here. Jane, you want to start, and then Julie? Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree that we should discuss it and make a decision. And I just wanted to suggest that I appreciate that document, but I don't want to fall on the asterisks, and just suggest that the reason I used it in the decision-making protocol was the sentence in the process roadmap above, which explicitly says, and we decided that it was important to have an executive branch council member as a co-chair of the subcommittees, and that we were clear that it could be the executive branch counselor or a designee. And so my interpretation of that language is that they are there as a council member and acting as such. And I just appreciate that that we're dealing with co-chairs who have carried forward a lot of the work at the subcommittee level. So it feels important to me to suggest that they help carry forward up to the council where the actual voting happens. So I just wanted to put that as a counter argument, but appreciate that the steering committee will decide.
Secretary Moore.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking for some clarification. My understanding is we are talking about voting at the subcommittee level, and almost regardless of whether they're acting as designees or not, the Global Warming Solutions Act provides explicit authority for the council to appoint members of subcommittees, either as counselors or members who are not members of the council, to serve as members of the subcommittee. And to me, they've been clearly identified as members of the subcommittee throughout. That's a distinction from the folks at the bottom of the sheet that are identified as staff. And I think when it comes to the council, it is the 23 members of the council that will vote, but I'm unsure why we're changing their status as members of subcommittees at this point in time.
I
Yeah,
don't
there is
understand the question. If the question could be framed up, it might be helpful to the discussion, because I'm not sure I understand.
I think I can take an attempt at that. There is a process in the roadmap that talks about when consensus is not reached at the subcommittee level, and that's talking about subcommittee members, not staff, but the subcommittee as a whole, that council members have a stronger voice in lifting forward what that recommendations to the council will be. And so we're talking about where and when there's disagreement at the subcommittee level, who gets to decide what the material is that's carried up and how that's reflected from the subcommittee to the council. it feels perhaps like a minor point, but for some of the subcommittees, I think it's probably important because they're having a hard time reaching consensus.
Right. So that's what we're talking about here, is exactly what Jane says, is within subcommittees, as subcommittees are trying to pull together this package to elevate up to the council. Because of concerns, and this goes back to March, February, concerns raised that it's only the councilors who really have this obligation on them, a legal obligation in the act, that they need to be the ones at the end of the day in the face of questions of lifting up the information out of the subcommittees and bringing it up to the full council. Again, the spirit of this obviously is a spirit of trying to work as a subcommittee. It's just, I'm trying to wrap my head around as well, sort of the eventualities that require us to make a decision about something like this. So Lauren, maybe if you can just say one more word about why this is particularly important to you and the eventualities you see where this is relevant, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I feel that it's important one way or another. There was a conversation yesterday about who was a designee and who wasn't. And so I went back to a membership document that was created where it was clearly identified who was and who wasn't. Jane just said the asterisk may have been an oversight. And maybe that's the case and this group can agree, but that's not what this group has in the past through consensus agreed to for membership on the respective subcommittees. So it's just an outstanding question I have, not necessarily a specific concern.
Okay. Okay. Abby, do you want to weigh in on this quickly?
Sorry. Yeah, I think just to clear, I think that we're dealing with two separate issues coming up around one specific point. So the first is that I think, I'm just going to say, I think from a power dynamic perspective, which is something that I don't believe we have well addressed in this process and is critical to the components of a just transition, but because of the deadline we're on, we didn't have time to do that. And so procedurally, there were concerns raised about this when we discussed it in March, and we didn't vote or anything around it. We just moved forward. As for, so that is one issue, right? Sort of how that can appear that it could be viewed that there is an outsized influence potential in the voting structure at the subcommittee level for one counselor because all counselors weren't able to have designees. Then the other issue that I think there is that we definitely need to take into consideration all of the immense work that has been done on the part of those staff who have been co-chairs. In other words, like I can and need to say publicly that Billy has been an utterly integral part to the work that has been done because I don't have the capacity to do everything that he has been able to do. So I think there's kind of two separate issues going on. And I think if we could address them as such so that they're clear like that, it might help. So maybe it's more that we need to determine that co-chairs who have been serving as subcommittee memberships are granted a vote in the subcommittee structure because of the fact that they've been there and participating, and just sort of clarify, as ridiculous as it may sound, the exact language around in what capacity they're taking that vote. I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of where I see some of the trickiness or tension points. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. Okay. All right. So on this issue, I'm not sure we can test the waters right now with you all as steering committee. I think this is an opportunity to do that. And I'd be interested to just do a quick check with folks. And when we look at our decision-making document and we see that in the event of a struggle in a subcommittee to really land in a consensus space and a need to make a decision about what items are lifted up to the council, that when you have the council members of that subcommittee making that decision, that you treat your co-chairs as council members and voting members who do that, right? So I want to just check with all of you that there's no concern about that. And or just do a quick straw poll with folks. You know, how do you as a steering committee feel about that? Treating the designees as, who are also co-chairs, right? As, you know, council members who would have that quote unquote vote if subcommittees are really struggling to reach a consensus and they need to do that. So I'd be interested to take people's temperature on that. We can do it in the chat quickly. I see there's a lot of hands going up, so let's have a quick conversation about it. And then let's move on from here. Julie, you want to go ahead, then Jared, and I see Kaya has her hand up too. I just want to be careful of time on this issue.
Yeah, I just, two clarifying questions, right? There are other people on these subcommittees as members that aren't council members. And I don't know how we would make a distinction between Billy's participation in ag and ecosystems and David Mears' participation in ag and ecosystems. Like there's, to me, it's a false distinction. These are people who've committed time and energy and their personal and professional resources to supporting the work of the subcommittees. The other piece I just want to flag is I think we also need similar clarity around whether liaisons from different committees who acknowledging, for example, there's been enormous value in having Jared participate in both the cross-sector and science and data subcommittee. Is the expectation then that he would pick one to vote on as opposed to voting on both? I think we're making something unnecessarily complicated. I don't think we spent a lot of time thinking about sort of the balance of these subcommittees in terms of administration versus council versus general public as we were building them, other than making sure we had some of each. I feel strongly that if you're listed on the sheet as a member of the subcommittee, you should be able to vote in the subcommittee process, and the rest of it will be handled when it reaches the council.
Okay, thanks. That is a little different than what's in our document. I will say that it's different than what's in the document, but thanks for that. And the spirit feels good on that. Jared?
Thanks. I appreciate and agree with Secretary Moore's comments. I'm just trying to think, practically how this plays out. I mean, I do think one thing that I feel like is clear in the Solutions Act is that the kind of final vote and drafting and binding actions, there's 23 counselors, 23 votes. And my sense is that in the subcommittees, what is getting elevated, hopefully, ideally, mostly by consensus, but sometimes not, is advisory recommendations for the council to consider. No subcommittee is making a binding action on behalf of the council. And so for that reason, and to respect the kind of participation of everybody who's devoting their time to the subcommittees, I would support saying we're aiming for consensus in the subcommittees. If we can't get it, let's do I hesitate to call it a vote because it's not binding, but a straw poll or something of the subcommittee members to agree and decide what to elevate to the council, which would then be either adopted by consensus or come to a vote. I do think it is important that we be clear that in terms of binding actions and votes, that has to be the 23 counselors that were, just in terms of democratic legitimacy, because they were either appointed by the governor, appointed by the Speaker of the House, or appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees, whereas our subcommittee process didn't go through that same process, and it's kind of a step away from those direct appointments.
Okay, so just to be clear, we're suggesting here that we're solving the problem we identified back in March in a different way than it's in our document. And that's fine, right? We can absolutely say what's in the document right now about it's council members of the subcommittees who are the ones at the end of the day responsible for lifting up these the issues to the council in the event you can't find consensus. And we're saying, you know what, we're fine If it's the subcommittees figuring out their own path, everybody feels more shared in how the decision-making is happening. The binding action happens at the council level. It's only recommendations coming up at the council, right? We can change that. I'm just saying it's a different solution than what we came up to in March. I'm conscious of time. Kaya and Liz, real quick to add on to this. I feel like we don't have time to actually land this ship right now. But Kaya, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on this, and I am grateful for the conversation around this. I think going back to kind of what Abby was trying to raise, this has been something that has been a concern since March, since this group has convened, that the subcommittees would not be given the pieces that they're pulling forth would potentially become and have an imbalance of power. The subcommittees are meant to create a balance of power, but structurally, the decision making, since it is held by the appointees, whom are still, again, like the broad diversity that is happening within the subcommittees is not reflective within the council itself, which is not of the doing of the subcommittee members. Like they had no say in why those that appointed chose to not consider the folks that are in the subcommittees to be on the council. So it's important that we don't lose that and disempower folks from feeling like it's great, I'm going to come up with this, and you may choose to move in a different direction than what we put in and invested in this great work, which should, by the time it gets to the council, be fairly ready to go, right? So I think it's going to be important that we continue to nuance this just a little bit, and thinking about what Secretary Moore was saying might be helpful for us to consider. I do agree, David, that we're not going to get this done today, but this might even be an important conversation to go back to the subcommittees with, so that there's a greater awareness as Jane's giving the presentations to each of these committees this week, to allow for that space for folks to reflect on that. There is that expectation from the public that it will be a continuous flow of power and that it will not be discordant between the subcommittees and the council itself, if that makes sense.
Okay. Thanks, Kaya. Liz, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Yeah, no, just, and forget the other piece of information that I was going to share 20 minutes ago. Two things. One, it would be, I think, helpful to have an updated, clarified, correct, and there's a few other changes that have happened in the interim, final subcommittee composition document on the public website. Looking at it in order to inform this conversation, it just looks like it needs updating for a couple of different reasons, including, somebody on cross-sector who resigned and was replaced, things like that. And second, this is my question, just so I understand. I agree with what Kaya just said in terms of speaking with the subcommittees this week. I personally would be fine revisiting the prior process in terms of the idea that it would just be council members who voted in the event of disagreement. But my question is, does this come down to what, one subcommittee, one person not listed as a designee? I guess I just don't understand how this even came about, because the original language to me, while maybe not the right perfect decision for sure, was also clear. So I just don't understand. I just need to understand whether this was a narrow issue because of like cross sectors co-chair, or I don't understand, or I'm sorry, Ag and Ecosystems co-chair. So I apologize, but I need to understand.
Yeah, great. So I'm concerned that we're going to run out of time, and I'm going to need to jump as well into another meeting. I have a very hard stop, and it feels like we are moving, you all are moving towards a shift in the way this is in your document. And it feels like we need to make a new version of this and talk about this later. And I'm not quite sure,
David, I really think we have consensus. And so
okay.
I just want to push that out there. So I believe that the steering committee members have indicated the way that Lauren has reflected in the chat, that we will update the process roadmap and reflect that out to the subcommittees, that all official members of the subcommittee have a vote if and when consensus cannot be reached. And so we will do that. And if anybody feels differently, they should say that now, but we need to move on that. And I think that clarity needs to go to the subcommittees this week.
Great. So let's do it. As put in the chat by Lauren, is there any concern about shifting to what we have in our document to say that if there is challenges in reaching consensus, all subcommittee members essentially are treated equally in a vote, if I am saying that correctly?
I just again, for clarity for the public and subcommittee, members who are following along, when you say the document, are you talking about the process roadmap that we have from
Yes.
the decision-making protocol from yesterday, or a different document? We just need to be specific. Is it the protocol
I'd like
for
to
making
treat
decisions?
Yeah, I'd like to think about using the decision-making protocol as an update to the process roadmap and clearly reflecting it in the decision-making protocol.
Correct. Because it's cut and paste, it cuts and pastes from the previous. Okay. So I just want to do it one more time. Does anybody have any concerns then in doing this change so that there's no distinction in the subcommittees if it comes time that we need a vote and there's no distinction among members? Does anybody have a concern about that?
I am good with that. I just want to be clear that that is on decisions of what to elevate to the council, and
Correct.
the final binding votes will happen at the council by the 23
Correct.
council members.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to have to bid a fairly abrupt exit. And I'm going to ask Jane if you can help guiding to the next pieces of this puzzle. And I apologize, I need to jump out. But thanks for doing the work, hard work on that decision-making piece. And hopefully we've solved that. So Jane, I'm going to turn this over to you to continue this, the last pieces of this meeting, if you don't mind.
Yes, I would ask, does anyone else have a hard stop at 9 o'clock? I know that I do. Julie does.
Lauren, go ahead.
I would just flag, if we're not getting to it, that Chris and I both agreed that the tabling concern from yesterday, I think Chris recommended just removing it, and I agreed, and I don't know if we came to consensus on that either.
Since I think that had been my suggestion in the first place, it was just trying to provide an additional path forward. If folks aren't comfortable with it, I agree with sort of Chris's representation that it's always an option, and it doesn't probably need to be explicitly identified as such. And I'm happy to see it removed.
Great. Okay, so the two updates around decision-making at the subcommittee level and removing of the tabling option. With that, do we feel like we have an updated document that can then go to the council for approval? I would like to take facilitator's liberty and suggest that we move the update on the cross-cutting themes group to next week's agenda, unless anybody has any comments. And I do really feel like I'd like to just briefly test the idea of scheduling council meetings weekly in November, and then use our steering committee meeting next week to discuss how and when, if the steering committee itself would continue to meet. I will say that it just to even have them on the agenda, on the calendar for folks, I think it's going to be really important. There are just so many things that the council needs to discuss and consider that it feels appropriate to me that we meet weekly in November.
I agree, Jane, with that suggestion. And I think to the extent we run out of things to talk about, we can always cancel a meeting, but having those held on people's calendars makes sense, particularly given the strong desire. I have also heard from counselors to have more time for discussion. I think having those two additional meetings will help ensure that there is.
Thank you so much. That is it. And Secretary Young, I'm happy to turn it over to you to see if there's any public comment.
Okay. If we have any members of the public who are on this meeting call or on Zoom itself, please raise your hand in the participant section. I see no hands raised. Jane, I don't know about on your end. So there's no public comment today. It sounds like we want to schedule at least 2 extra meetings in November. I assume we're going to bring this up with the full council at the next meeting, or you're going to make sure folks are okay with that informally, Jane. So rather than just dropping it
Yes.
on them in a council meeting, because
Well,
that's a lot of.
actually, I appreciate that clarification. My understanding was that the steering committee could approve those meetings, and so I would plan to make a suggestion or a recognition that they've been scheduled at the next council meeting, but
Okay.
my preference would be to schedule them based on steering committee approval.
Yeah, no, I know my point is to make sure people have advance notice, and if there really is a lot of concern and inability to attend, we can deal with it at the next steering committee meeting.
Perfect.
And again, I guess just on those agendas on the equity portions, I'm hoping, welcome Kaya in your new role. I'm hoping that we can use those. I know we talked about how to use that time in the future. I just want to throw out for people to think about. I'm hoping that we can use that time to discuss any issues that are coming up within the climate action plan around equity that we haven't had, the subcommittees haven't had a chance to come to agreement on. I'm just hoping we can use that time focused on the plan and the equity principles we're supposed to fold in, rather than spending it on information that's not directly relevant to the plan if we have that option. So that's just one thing I was thinking about yesterday after we talked about that block of time in every council meeting, and that we don't need to decide today. I just wanted to throw out that idea for thought.
Great.
Okay, so with all that, unless there's anything else from the steering committee members, we will see you at the next meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.